All right, well, moving right along now. Who says you can't recycle political ads? The Americans for Prosperity Super PAC, along with Citizens Against Government Waste, is bringing back one of those scary ads from the 2010 election, just in time for Halloween. But instead of ghosts and goblins, China is the scary monster lurking in the shadows in the year 2030. The spot shows what seems to be a professor in a classroom teaching his students about why great nations fail, comparing the United States with the Greek and Roman empires. Now, you might remember it, but here's a piece.
美国政府企图以庞大的开支和税收来摆脱严重的经济衰退，巨额的所谓刺激开支、庞大的医疗改革、政府接管私有企业、债务累累。当然，我们是他们的大债主。现在他们都得给我们干活。
Now, the ad will run through November 11th on cable networks across the country. China is so often the go-to fearmonger nation, and this was no exception during the presidential primaries, even coming from the Romney camp. And this anti-China rhetoric is creeping up again in the presidential debates.
With respect to China, China's both an adversary, but also a potential partner in the international community if it's following the rules. So my attitude coming into office was that we are going to insist that China plays by the same rules as everybody else.
We can be a partner with China. We don't have to be an adversary in any way, shape, or form. We can work with them. We can collaborate with them if they're willing to be responsible.
But while President Obama and Mitt Romney cast stones at the country while cautiously agreeing that the U.S. needs to find ways to get along with the Chinese, there might be a bigger threat to international trade and the U.S. economy. Now, that is the secretive multinational trade agreement known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Critics say that the TPP threatens to extend restrictive intellectual property laws across the globe and rewrite international rules to enforce those laws. Now, Melinda St. Louis is the International Campaigns Director with Public Citizen and joined me earlier to talk about why the TPP is such a threat to American industry.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership is this trade talks with Pacific Rim nations, and it's an example of how corporate money really does influence politics and policies in our country. What we've seen, particularly with the discussion around China, on one hand, you hear President Obama talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a way to contain China, and that they're talking with other Pacific Rim nations so that they can contain China, while on the other hand, the U.S. Trade Representative says they would actually love nothing more than for China to be a part of these negotiations. So what you're actually seeing is it's a way for corporate America to try to get through the back door, through so-called trade talks, a way to get policies that they can't get through a democratic process. And if they need to scapegoat China as a way to try to convince Congress and the public to do that, that's what they're trying to do.
And yet we do know that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is shrouded in so much secrecy. There are so many things that we just don't know about this bill, about this partnership, about what it could possibly do and offer for Americans. Can you talk a little bit about what we don't know and what we do know more specifically?
Well, what's very concerning is the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been going on, the negotiations have been going on for more than 2.5 years, and yet the people in the United States barely even know that it exists. It's happening completely behind closed doors, but there are nearly 600 corporate advisors who have access to the text, who know what's happening, and yet the public, Congress, and the media are completely left out of knowing what's happening. But given a few leaks that we have seen through the process, we're very concerned about what's actually inside these negotiations. We've seen that it's an attempt for big pharmaceutical corporations to try to extend their monopolies to block out generic competition to keep drug prices high, which is basically the antithesis of free trade. We see it as a way for large copyright owners to try to police the internet, to reduce internet freedom for people. And we're seeing it as ways for foreign investors, both in the United States and other countries, countries to try to attack our public interest, our public health, our environmental laws that they think that are going to affect their future profits. And so what we see is that it's actually not very much about trade at all, but much more about this 1% corporate agenda to try to get through in the back door.
Much more about preserving that right to keep the money flowing between the countries, but not necessarily to protect what the rest of the country possibly needs. So let's also talk about the fact that this is happening under President Obama. As you said, it's been happening for the last few years. Would a Mitt Romney administration change it, or would it make it worse?
Well, we basically, what we're seeing through both candidates is that they both are committed to this corporate-led so-called free trade agenda, basically expanding the failed NAFTA model, and we don't see much difference between what they're actually pushing for. What we saw President Obama in his 2008 campaign said that he actually did intend to try to fix the problems of the NAFTA model. But what we're seeing through the TPP, unfortunately, is just an extension of those failed policies that actually offshore jobs, that actually encourage more, the loss of more U.S. manufacturing jobs. And then we also see all of these other very concerning policies that attack our public interest regulations and regulating Wall Street, all types of regulations that we believe are very important in order to protect the public interest.
And yet what we have here today is like we showed, that we're showing this harsh criticism of China, which is one of the partners in the agreement. They're pretty instrumental from what I understand.
Well, actually, at this point, they are not part of the agreement at this point, but it's intended to be a docking agreement that perhaps China at some point in the future could join.
Right. And China makes so many goods. They manufacture so much. So what possible interest, or would it hurt the U.S. and maybe the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the future to be partnering with China, or to be cracking down on China? Would that have any effect on what's going on with the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, what's interesting is that the U.S. position, or President Obama's position, that they're using the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a way to contain China could be very detrimental to the negotiations. There are people, New Zealand, for example, in the negotiations has said that if it were intended to try to contain China or to be a counterweight to China, they would actually pull out of the negotiations. So it'll be interesting to see whether they do indeed do that, now that we've seen that in the election cycle, the candidates are using the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as a way to bait China. While, again, speaking out of the other side of their mouth, they're actually saying that they would like for China to be able to join eventually. So I definitely the prize, the market for most of the corporations that are engaged in these in TPP, they're looking at Vietnam, which is a part of the negotiations, and probably eventually China, Japan, others as well that could join later.
And Melinda, let's quickly talk about, we only have about a minute left, but let's quickly talk about what other alternatives there are to NAFTA and to the TPP. What can these nations do to work together to ensure free trade, but at the same time also protect their countries, their people, and not, like you say, the 1%?
Well, what needs to happen is that the negotiations need to be made public. We need to know what's actually being proposed for our countries. We need to be able to have a true public debate, to be able to put out on the table that, yes, we can engage in trade, but we can do that in a very responsible way, protecting our national sovereignty, making sure that our regulations in the public interest, protecting the environment, protecting public health, are able to move forward, and that they're not undermined by corporate interests.
All right. Melinda St. Louis, International Campaigns Director for Public Citizen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.